So welcome everybody to session 2 of 5 of this module is actually called the Wisdom Realizing Emptiness. If we just call it emptiness, we might get a little bit stuck because emptiness itself is just what's out there already. That's how things exist already. It's nothing special. but to realize that is quite profound. And that's why it's better probably to call it the wisdom realizing emptiness, because that's what's actually going to get us out of all the suffering in the end. Emptiness itself is, not going to do anything. It's just there, whether we like it or not, whether we realize it or not. So better to call it wisdom realizing emptiness. And before we start, as usual, we're going to just do take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. If we're Buddhists already, then that is kind of we've already committed ourselves to follow their example and be as close to their example as we can. And then if we're not a Buddhist already, we're just taking it as an option, just, looking at the details, figuring it out for ourselves. And then bodhicitta, these last 2 lines, is the big heart, is to think about all the living beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of the body and mind. And then to think, may I become a Buddha, an enlightened being myself, to be able to liberate all those beings. It's quite a job, because there's a lot of them. And then we'll do this verse from the Vinaya, which kind of brings the Buddha's teachings into these 2 aspects, compassion and wisdom, the 2 wings of a bird we talked about last week. So I'm just going to share my screen with you. So we've all got those in front of us. So I'll recite it twice in Tibetan and then once in English. You can join me if you like. Sangye chirang saki chotnam lai janchu padu dadni kapsuchi dagi ingi versanangi jala penche sangye jupada shog. Sangye chirang saki chotnam lai janchu padu dagni kapsuchi dagi chenyengi pesenamgi jala penche sangejo pasho. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. And this next verse. He who, caring with compassion, taught the holy Dharma so that all wrong views would be abandoned. Gautama, homage to him. Okay, so I'm just going to close those windows and get to my notes. So last week we kind of put this this particular module, if you like, this particular realization into context of all the Buddha's teaching. So you can divide, as I said, into that method and wisdom, or that compassion and wisdom. Obviously the wisdom realizing emptiness falls into the wisdom aspect there. And then we also talked about another way of dividing all the Buddha's teachings into the Lam Rim, which was small, middle, and great scopes. And each of those has little steps. Actually, even before you get to small scope, there's a couple of points to think about, which is relying correctly on a spiritual teacher, precision and rebirth. And then the small scope starts with the impermanence, which is death, etc. So a bit of a recap on those then maybe. So what are these 3 levels? 3 levels of the Lam Rim. Anybody?
Small, middle, and great.
Fantastic. Good. Yeah. And what are the main practices of the practitioner of the small scope?
Wanting to be free of the lower realms.
Yes, that's the aspiration. That's what they're wanting to achieve. But how do they do that? What do they do to get out, to be free of the lower realms?
Those 10 things.
they avoid those 10 things.
Yes.
They don't do those 10 things.
They don't.
Do they or don't they?
No, they don't do them. They don't do them.
All right.
Okay, they don't do 11 things. They don't do the things they should do. They don't do all this.
So yeah, when you study it in detail, you see there's a list of 10 non-virtuous actions. So you want to avoid those.
Yeah.
Or you could say it the other way around, and then after that in the text, Lama Tsong Khapa says in the middle, Great Lama, for example, he then goes on to explain the 10 virtuous actions, which is, not exactly the opposite, but something obviously related to that. So anyway, that's a practice of the being of the small scope. So Adita, what's the practices of the middle scope?
The practices would be the 3 higher trainings.
Fantastic, which are?
Ethics, concentration, and wisdom.
Superb, yeah. So the goal of the person of a middle scope is what, Michelle?
To go further than the first scope.
Right.
To get out of samsara.
Fantastic, exactly, to get out the whole mess completely. Right, good.
That was a fluke. No, it wasn't meant to be.
Good. All right, then. So then all that's left is the great scope practitioner. So these are the bodhisattvas who are working with bodhicitta. And the main goal of that scope then, Edita, is what?
So the goal is to develop bodhicitta and become enlightened and develop bodhicitta for all sentient beings.
Say what?
For all sentient beings.
Right. So to become enlightened for all sentient beings is bodhicitta. So you don't have to say them both.
Okay.
It's the same thing, right? So the aspiration of bodhicitta is to become enlightened for all sentient beings' sake. So that is also the goal of the practitioner of the great scope. So what do they do to achieve that, Michelle? I'm not sure we mentioned this in much detail last week, but I think you're muted, Michelle.
Because my dog is just doing her buzz before she chills out, and it sounds like my house has been burgled. I've got E, C, and W written down for 3 words, and I haven't got them filled in.
Well, that's the ethics, concentration, and wisdom. That was the 3 trainings of the.
Okay.
Right.
So it's going a bit further than that.
Yep.
I've got foe destroyer. You realise that everyone is still stuck in the lower realms. No, I think
No, you haven't got it there, have you? Adita,
No.
what have you got there? What's the practices of the Adita? What's the practices of the great scope?
helping others to get there. I know.
Right.
Is it the 6 perfections?
6 perfections, right? Yes. 6 of those. Yeah. It's all lists, Good. Well remembered between us. We got there. Fantastic. So then the wisdom realizing emptiness is the practice of which scope? How does that fit in? I mean, everyone needs it, really. And the great scope and middle scope practitioners need it, but where is it actually found, technically speaking?
Middle.
Middle, you both agree?
Yeah, we both said it at the same time then, didn't we? Yeah.
Good. Right, exactly, yeah. Because that's what we need to get out of samsara. And that, remember, is the aspiration, primary aspiration of the middle scope practitioner, right? So they definitely need that to achieve their goal. Ethics, concentration, and wisdom. Ethics is leading to the concentration leads to the wisdom, and the wisdom is leading them out of samsara. So those 3 work very closely together. All right, good. So so as I mentioned last week then, what's keeping us stuck in samsara is the afflicted states of mind. That's what makes us, miserable. It's what kind of keeps us needy and grasping. It's what kind of keeps us tied into the matrix, as it were, right? It's what keeps us locked in to just wanting the kind of temporary benefits of this life. And it doesn't help us see, that actually it's very temporary and we're going to be off into the next life without any control before we know it. It kind of keeps us very short-sighted and blinkered. And those afflicted states of minds are very painful to experience. For one thing, they make the mind very disturbed and unsettled. Even those things that the kind of graspy, attachment-based ones, the needy ones, they might seem like they're helping us get what we want. They're helping us direct us, if you like, energy towards objects that we find attractive. But actually, that is also a bit unsettling for the mind because we can't rest. It's not peaceful to be always wanting or needing, or you can't stop thinking about something you're craving for food, whatever, people, positions, power, money, who knows. It doesn't make us very settled. So those minds, from a Buddhist point of view, are also called destructive emotions, or, you know, how we're going to say it, because they destroy the peace of the mind. So all these fictive states of minds have this characteristic of causing us to be disturbed in some way, unsettled. Another characteristic of all these disturbing states of mind is that they're all delusional. So delusion is another word, another translation for this word, which is really actually really juicy, because delusion is kind of implying that there's something that we're seeing that's not there. There's some false projections going on there. So where we think it's one way, but actually how it exists is completely different. And this is a clue to how we're going to get to wisdom realizing emptiness, because things exist in a way that is different to how they appear. So that's a statement that we're going to hear a lot as we approach and we study more this topic about wisdom realizing emptiness. Things appear differently to how they actually exist. And what that means is that it's our mind is creating certain projections of how things exist and making assumptions. We believe it. We never questioned it. Why would we? You know, it doesn't make sense to question it. But the Buddha was quite profound and realized, actually, this is the root of all the suffering in the end. So when the Buddha was sat underneath this Bodhi tree in India, in Bodh Gaya, one of the things he realized there was the fact that things don't exist as concretely and as inherently as they appear. It's much more subtle than that. And that was how, you know, he became enlightened. So, so how are they? Let's just look at this first. Then we're going to get to the root in a minute, but let's just go back in stages. So how do we actually project wrongly? Let's look at that first. Because we have to start with the gross kind of branches and the little bits on the outside. And then the root of it all is this innate ignorance, which they all kind of share, which is like the trunk of the tree. But let's look on the outside, the branches first of all. And let's take an example of anger, for example. Anger is very immediate and very powerful and very clear in its nature, its kind of style, if you like. So when we're angry at a person, for example, which is what we probably most experience on a day-to-day basis, when we're angry at a person, you know, what we see then is something that's 100% kind of negative, polluted, disgusting, can't bear to be with it. We have this aversion for this object, this person or a thing, and we want to be separated from it. We're kind of pushing some kind of energy there. We want to be separated from it somehow. Now, it's interesting to think about if it's someone that we normally like and we get angry and we suddenly hate them. You know, hate is a strong word, but obviously that's part of the entourage, if you like, or part of the I can't think of the word. Anyway, part of the group of emotions that come up with anger. Even if it's somebody we normally like, we'll think of them as 100% unlikable or ugly, you know. Even if normally we're very kind to this person, normally they'd be really kind to us. If they do something we don't like and we flip into anger, then everything is just very black and white suddenly. And it's like, bam, everything they do is false. Everything they do is wrong. They've always hated me. Everything's always like this. And especially if we think about ourselves, when we get, when it goes inwards, that anger and that hate, oh, I'm so worthless. There's nothing I can do about it. It's always hopeless. Everything I do is wrong. Everybody hates me. I'm never going to be any good. And it's all just gets very fundamental and very short-sighted and very narrow, whereas things are much more complex than that. There's so many different parts to people, to events. You know, it's so much more rich. But these emotional states kind of bring us into just one aspect of it, which find it difficult. And basically it lies to us in some sense, you could say, right? It's lying. So they're deceptive appearances. They're false in some sense. So that's why we say, you know, delusional, because things are not like that. A person is never 100% one way or the other, right? So one minute they could be our enemy, you know, if we're thinking about it in terms of hating someone or not liking someone. The next minute they could be, you know, they do something nice to us, and suddenly, you know, we're back to like, oh, actually, this person isn't so bad. I don't know what I was thinking about. Actually, this person is very nice. And then if they give you, you know, something profoundly important to you, you're going to really love this person. And then we're back to the other state, which is actually you can't bear to be without them, especially if we think about what we used to, well, what I cynically, you know, call falling in love now. You know, you fall in love with somebody, actually, it's probably just mostly attachment. I would suggest you have to figure that out for yourself, but mostly just attachment, and it's taken over, and everything this person does is just fantastic. The way that they wear their clothes is amazing. The glasses that they wear are so cool. The way they smell is so lovely. The things that they say, their voice sounds so beautiful. The way that they snore in the night is just so cute, and the way they flick their hair is just, if they had any hair, it's just so beautiful. It's just everything becomes so over the top attachment based this time. It's the other way around. Now we can't bear to be separated. The object is here and we're here. We have to be glued to it the whole time. When this person is away, we're kind of always craving this person. This person might be craving us back. So you're always trying to be as close as you can to this person or this object or this thing. And then again, we're being lied to because we assume everything this person does is just beautiful and wonderful. And that's also completely unrealistic, because this person isn't that either. And it won't take long before suddenly it flips and they do something you don't like, and suddenly it's like, oh, can't stand the way they wear their clothes. Those cute glasses are so ugly. Can't stand the way they snore. It's keeping me awake. Can't stand their clothes. The way they smell is disgusting. Suddenly, all the same things that you were kind of like could be without, and now they're exactly the same things that you're now throwing aversion onto. But they themselves probably haven't done anything. It's not their fault. It's just all the stuff that we're throwing onto them. Poor people. So, and we go through this quite a lot, that's an extreme example perhaps, but we go through this state a lot throughout the day of kind of projecting onto things that we're attached to, or when somebody then puts an obstacle in our way or can't get what we want, so suddenly aversion kicks in, and then we hate this person, or we hate this thing that's got in our way, or we can't bear the thing that's stopping us to get what we want, or we get depressed and we get down, and suddenly something will be beneficial in our worldly view, and then somebody back up again. So we kind of go up and down, up and down, up and down. Whereas really, these objects are just, doing their own thing. It's how we're approaching them that is the problem. That's getting to the key of it. These things are not as they appear. So there we go with that phrase again. These things appear differently to how they're actually existing. So that's the one thing to bear in mind about the afflicted states of mind, is they're liars, they're delusional, they're painting a picture of something that's not actually there. Yeah, so that's a couple of things to bear in mind when we talk about afflictive states of mind, delusional states of mind. They disturb the mind's peace in one way or another. And then also there's some false element to them. That's the kind of characteristic that they all share. Now, there's different levels of these, the grosser ones, obviously, and subtler ones. But where it all comes from is this root of the tree, this ignorance, basically about how things exist. Because if we understood how things really exist, we'd be able to cut these afflictive states of minds at the root, and they wouldn't be able to grow. We'd have killed off the root. So we have to understand this root, and that's what we're trying to get to here today. So we understand what this root delusion is. So sometimes we can put all these delusions into these three categories of the three root delusions. Do you know what they are? Anybody? These three root delusions?
Isn't there ignorance, attachment, and aversion?
Good, that's it. Yeah, exactly. So ignorance is the main one. And then from those, these attachment kind of being stuck to needy, grasping minds. We call them attachment for the sake of a better word. Not as an attachment theory, that's something slightly different, so don't get confused with that one. And then aversion are the ones that push objects away. And they can be like a mild irritation all the way through to absolute rage and hate, where you can't, you're almost going to kill the person or the thing. It's kind of, it gets to that state. You can't bear the person to even exist. You'd rather just be completely eradicated. So it can be that extreme. Not that we're probably going to get to that stage, but you can understand how it gets there, right? So those are the two kind of categories, those two modes. Basically, we could divide everything into those two, and the root of those two is this ignorance about how things exist. So let's look at this ignorance first of all. Then, so when we say ignorance, we're not talking so much about not knowing. So usually when we say someone's ignorant, what we usually think of is they just don't know something. If someone's being ignorant, just that they're behaving badly, or ignorant of how quantum mechanics works. I have no idea really. I can read a book about it, but I have no idea how it actually works. I'm quite ignorant about that. Or I could say I'm ignorant about, what's happening on the street outside right now, because I can't see it, I can't hear it. So I'm ignorant, I just don't know. No clue, right? That's not so much the ignorance we're talking about here. What we're really talking about here is the ignorance that is actively getting something wrong. It's knowing something, but it's knowing it wrongly. If that makes sense. We're knowing things, we're perceiving things, the things are going into our senses, and we're making some judgments, and the mind is apprehending those objects, but then it's making a false kind of understanding of that. It hasn't got the wisdom there, it's making mistakes. So that ignorance is kind of like an active misknowing. So sometimes we use that term misknowing, making mistakes. Does that kind of, does that make sense? So there are, in the text when we talk about this type of ignorance, there are some masters who said in the past, these two are related. Like it's like ignorance is not knowing, is like a cloudiness and a darkness, and on that basis then we actively misknow something. So there can be a way to explain it as both those types, but generally speaking, it's described as this misknowing type. So is that clear? That's the first thing to think about. Why we're talking about ignorance is because that's what we have already. That's what I kind of have to know what we've got first before we can know how to correct it. We have to know what we're looking for. We have to know exactly how the mind is misknowing. We have to know exactly what the mind is getting wrong before we can correct it. Otherwise, we'll just be throwing, shots in the dark. We'll be firing arrows in the dark, trying to hit a target. We have no idea what we're looking for. So we have to get really clear what exactly this ignorance is doing before we can find its opposite. Now, all these deluded states of minds have opposites. So if we think about a state of mind like anger, for example, a good opposite to that one is patience, being able to have courage not to retaliate when things go wrong. Also, love, is opposite to hate. If you're deeply wishing to help somebody, you're not going to deeply wish to harm them at the same time. All right. So usually, always these afflictive states of minds have an opposite. We could call it an antidote, if you like, or a nemesis, or something that if one is playing in the mind, the other can't exist at the same time. So that's another bit of Buddhist psychology for you there. If you can learn, the opposites of these, then they don't work together. So the opposite of miserliness, for example, is a mind of generosity. Those two can't exist at the same time. The mind of jealousy is often opposed by a mind of rejoicing in this person's qualities. Those two can't exist at the same time. The opposite of pride is to think, actually, I don't know an awful lot. There's so many different things I don't know about quantum mechanics, or about how a telephone works, or about electrical engineering, or about architecture. There's so many things I don't know. Actually, you can't, if you think about carefully, pride is a false one. You can't know everything. So that's the gross ones. But at a fundamental level, the opposite to ignorance is the wisdom realizing how things actually exist. And that is what is the main antidote to get out of something. The other ones are tiny temporary antidotes. The love, the compassion, etc. Those are temporary antidotes to the afflictions. But really, if we haven't faced the root one, the others are still going to come back at some point and bite us in the, you know what I mean. So they're going to come back and hurt us later. So any questions so far? So we talked a little bit about the afflictions, their nature, they're delusional, and we looked a bit about ignorance. I'm going to look at some more of this, but any questions so far?
Just a recap. So the three, you asked a question of which Aditya answered: ignorance, attachment, and aversion. They were the three, is it causes of root delusion, or
They are the three root delusions.
Just the three root delusions, yeah.
If you've ever seen that painting of the wheel of life, where there's this big Yama Lord of Death holding this wheel with different parts in it, right in the middle of that circle, these three root delusions, I'm just looking at it in front of me, these three root delusions are represented as a a pig, a rooster, and a snake all kind of
Really?
combined together. Yeah.
Oh, I've not noticed
Pig is
that.
the
Is that the-
ignorance. The two, I forget which one is which now, but anyway, yeah.
The panorama man, I used to call him, but it's not. It's yeah. You think, is it that one you're describing?
The panorama man.
Oh no. I can't. Oh God, I haven't studied this for a long time. It's like. Sorry, it's my dog.
All right.
Move on. I've
Yeah, okay, might come back to you. But that's quite significant, having those three at the middle of that wheel of life, because that, you know, if you're going in one direction, it's about, you know, how we get stuck in samsara, and the whole wheel of samsara, it's like a cycle, the whole wheel that turns on these three root delusions. That's what keeps us tied in, this ignorance, which is represented actually in the wheel as this blind man wandering around. Okay, so yeah, any other questions?
My dog is making me feel angry.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to. I'm going to try and add the antidote of patience.
Okay, good luck.
And therefore that what I give off with that antidote will hopefully get to her and cause her to be quiet, as per the example given there.
Good luck.
Thanks very much.
So then one Lama is a very nice analogy for this. One Lama described, it might be Pabon Rinpoche, I forget now, sorry. One Lama describes it as this whole thing of ignorance and the delusions is like we've drawn a picture of a lion, and then we get scared by the lion we just drawn. That's nice. I always like that analogy. I want to think about what we're doing with our emotions and our minds. So let's just think about emptiness then, and how things are actually existing. So what happens here is you get a little bit, the brain goes a little bit kind of crazy because they're trying to process lots of different terms. We don't know what the terms refer to yet. So I'm going to throw some of these words at you, but don't worry, just hear the words and you'll have some concept for them eventually. So emptiness is simply, you know, a lack of something. Don't have to get all, you know, mystical and religious about it. It just means that something isn't there. So I could say that in this room there is an emptiness of an elephant. You have to take my word for it because you can't see, but there is no elephant in this room. So this room has an emptiness of elephant. Makes sense, right? It's just a kind of I suppose a philosophical, psychological way of talking about this topic. It can't be effectively talked about in words so easily. It has to be experienced yourself, but we have to start with the words. We have to get an idea through the words. That's how it all starts, right? So, but in the end, we have to get away from the words. Anyway, so we could say there is an emptiness of an elephant in this room. Would you agree? Is there an emptiness of elephant in your room? Is there an emptiness of elephant in your room?
Yes.
Yes. And yours? Yeah. So you could say you have a wisdom realizing the emptiness of elephant in your room. Right? Now, if you turn the lights off, you know, you'd probably have a good, you know, guess there's probably no elephant in a room, but you wouldn't be able to know exactly. You know, there could be an elephant in a room. It's unlikely, right? But, you know, in the darkness, it's a very good analogy. In the darkness, you know, you haven't got certainty. So, you know, using maybe inferential knowledge and what you know about your room and the circumstances, it's pretty good to bet there's no elephant in your room. But, you know, if the lights are off, then all you can say is, I'm pretty sure there's no elephant in the room. But until you got the lights on, you can't say for definite.
I've got elephant wallpaper actually to my left, my line. So sorry for lying to you, friends. Yeah,
not a live elephant.
Right.
No. Specific. A live elephant. Yeah. So when you got the lights off, obviously that's a bit like we are at the moment. Until we've had the wisdom realizing emptiness, we're not going to be able to see directly how things actually exist. So I'm just trying to think of the best way to come at this topic. I get confused myself sometimes, you know. So let's look at this term then. Things don't exist inherently. So there's lots of synonyms that we use in this topic. So how things actually exist and how they don't exist, let's get that clear in our minds. So we use a lot of negation because we're saying things don't exist in a certain way. And then we say, or we could say from the other side, things exist this way or they don't exist this way. So it's referring to the same thing, just coming from two different angles, right? So things don't exist inherently. Let's get that one clear. So inherently has this kind of quality of, you know, it's in the object. It's there somewhere. If you look for it, you would find it. Inherently, it's in there. Inherently isn't a word we use that often, but it's used a lot with around this topic in English translations. Yeah. So for example, well, no, let's get the examples later. Let's get the words first. So how it does exist is it exists as mere label. Let's go with that one to start with. There's lots of different ways of saying it. This is merely labeled by the mind. If we're saying more, like Lama Zopa says in the what was it that Lama Zopa says, Adita, in the end of the Vajrasattva practice, that last dedication verse? Remember what he says there? You have to unmute yourself.
Empty from your own side.
Empty from your own side. So Lama Zopa is great at doing this dedication verse at the end of practices, trying to combine emptiness with this kind of how we think about things existing. So he says, may the I, who is empty of existing from its own side, achieve the state of full enlightenment, which is completely empty of existing from its own side. And need all living beings who are completely empty of existing from their own side, so that state of complete enlightenment, which is completely empty of existing from its own side, by myself alone, who am completely empty of existing from my own side. So you kind of saying that there is something there, but this is how it actually exists. It's quite subtle. And that's one of Lama Zopa's skillful means to help us understand this topic. So it's like me saying, you know, I'm speaking into this laptop, which is empty from its own side, doesn't exist from its own side, to speaking to Adita and Michelle, who don't exist from their own side, but emptiness, which doesn't exist from its own side. So they will become enlightened, which doesn't exist from its own side. So we're not denying that things exist, which is how they exist is what we're saying, right? So we have to be careful we don't fall into the pit of believing that nothing exists. It's not nihilism, because that will get us into a right mess. And then what we'll find then is that karma, cause and effect, will become untenable, and then we're going to get right trouble if we don't have the law of karma and effect. So one Lama says actually that, I think it was Geshe Tashi when I studied this topic with him, he says, you know, if you start to feel that you're losing sense of reality and that you start to think cause and effect actually don't exist, so I can do what I like, then you should stop thinking about emptiness and go back to just concentrating on the reality of karma, cause and effect, small scope, because that is really dangerous if you start thinking that, because then you're likely to end up in difficult situations like lower realms, right? If you don't think there's any consequences to your actions, then you're going to get into real problems. So it's not nihilism to think that nothing exists. They were not thinking that. Emptiness is not nihilism. Things do exist. So as Lama Zopa says, may the I, so he's affirming that yes, there is an I, so there is an I that doesn't exist from its own side, become enlightened, which doesn't exist from its own side. So there is something there, right? There is an I who's going to be enlightened for the sake of all the living beings by myself alone. But each of those things don't exist inherently. So you have to kind of tread this middle way between what we think now, which is that things exist from their own side, and nihilism. So it's often called, you know, walking the middle way, because we can fall into these extremes. So the extreme that we're in at the moment is that we think things do exist from their own side inherently. Those two terms are synonymous: existing from their own side and inherently. Am I going too fast? Are you with me? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just making notes and hoping for the best, but I'm following.
Exactly. Good. All right. So we're walking a tightrope here between thinking that things exist from their own side and thinking that they don't exist at all. We're trying to get in the middle of those two. Things do exist, But how they exist, Lama Zopa says, is so subtle, it's almost like they don't exist at all. So the ignorance that we have now is mainly on this side of believing that things have a concrete existence. We're already in the extreme on this side, which is most of us instinctively go to, or just instinctively had since beginning of time, is that there is an inherent nature in stuff. We've never questioned it, of course, until someone like the Buddha, prompts us to maybe think about it. There are people who do think things don't exist at all, isn't there? There are some groups around the planet that are nihilists and think it doesn't matter, there is no inherent nature in anything at all. Nothing exists really. Anyway, we won't go into that. But anyway, that's a danger if we go too far one way or the other. Now, interesting to think about also is that, just little facts about emptiness before we go into the next section. Things to think about emptiness is things have always been empty since beginningless time. It's not like suddenly the Buddha kind of made things empty by realizing that. Realizing just means he saw it was there already. So realizing is quite hard, but the things around us now are already empty of inherent existence. They're empty of existing from their own side already, and they have been since forever. And they will be forever. There's never a time when they're going to be suddenly inherent again. That's just how things always have been, always will be. Yeah. And it's realizing that it's just realizing what's already there. It's not that we're adding anything on to something that isn't there. And they have always been like that. Just we've never seen it yet. We never realized it. So that word realizing, it takes a little get used to using. We talk about a lot about realizing in the Lamrim, realizing this, that, and the other, but we're talking about wisdoms. We're talking about the mind is directly able to see things finally as they actually exist. Our impermanence. All sentient beings haven't been our mother. So, in a nutshell, then, that's a little bit about the ignorance and the wisdom that we're trying to aim for. So on the one hand, we've got these synonyms for ignorance, which is, it's misknowing how things actually exist. We're thinking they exist inherently. We think they exist from their own side. Nothing to do with us. Things are quite solid. And on the other side, we have the wisdom realizing emptiness, realizing that things don't exist inherently, that things don't exist from their own side. They're not concrete. So those are the terms we need to get to grips with this topic. There's two extremes. Any questions? So how we meditate to realize this is what we're going to talk about in the next sessions, next week and the week after. Just we have to prove to the mind that what we're seeing is wrong, and that takes a bit of work. So we have to use logic to debate with our superstitious mind, as Lama Zopa called it. We have to debate with our ignorance and prove it wrong. But now we just assume things as they are as they exist. But this topic, as we said earlier, is about realizing that things don't exist the way that they appear. There's a disparity there. And the extent to which, we're out of touch is the extent to which we will suffer mentally. The more we put concreteness or inherentness into objects and people and things and ourselves, the more we will experience difficulty with the mind, because the more it's going to be projecting like crazy, and the more we're going to be out of touch. And the more we're out of touch, that kind of cognitive dissonance is going to drive us nuts, because the reality is going to be constantly bouncing in our face, and we're projecting another way. So this kind of this disconnect with how things actually are working and functioning and how we're thinking they function, the stronger that opposite, the more we're going to experience disturbances in the mind. Now, one of the ways into this is to think about impermanence. guess Jean Paul, the abbot of Nanda Monastery, said, realizing emptiness is like 80% realizing impermanence, which is really special because that's one of the first realizations that we should think about in terms of the small scope, right? Remember, especially the gross element, which is our own death, our impermanence. So those things around us, and our bodies, ourselves, and our minds, they're all changing. There's two levels of impermanence here. There's one that we can see. So the impermanence, for example, if the sun rising and falling, we can see that quite clearly, can't we? So we know things are changing there. The planet's moving. People didn't even believe that, did they? Though it's only recently we got there. We can see as our body ages. We're not the same as when we were younger. Things are falling apart, losing hair, etc. Yeah. We can see, if it was recently a building burnt down in Leeds, like old council building. So there we could definitely see impermanence. This building that was supposed to be there for ages and ages, suddenly, in 24 hours, it was burnt to the ground. That's quite a stark example of gross impermanence. But it all comes from this underlying subtle impermanence. It's changing every moment. There's no one moment where everything is static. And that is important to think about because that is a good example of, things existing differently than how they appear. So I'm looking at this laptop in front of me, and it seems quite solid, unchanging, apart from the things on the screen that might be moving. Well, the structure of it seems to be quite solid, and maybe you're looking at your laptops or computers and thinking the same, or iPads, whatever. It seems quite solid. But we know, don't we now? We know already that it's full of these changes that are happening on a molecular level, atomic level. There's just nuts in there, isn't it? It's just crazy. Most of it is just space, apparently. And we're still discovering even more subtle and subtle particles in there, aren't we? And we know that scientists have already proven that is how all things are made of, these atoms and subatomic particles. So we don't realize that, do we? We're looking at it, and actually on a molecular level, subatomic level, these things are just like so fragile, so whizzing about all over the place. But it doesn't look like that, so we don't believe that. And that's something that's very similar to emptiness, because these things look solid and we believe it. We believe how they look. We don't think about their actual nature underneath it all. So these things around us are just constant flux. Everything around us, the floor, the ceiling, our bodies. Our bodies is a good one to think about, because our bodies are made up of all these cells. And we know from scientific investigations under electron microscopes and whatever, these cells are just like little powerhouses of amazing activity, full of all kinds of stuff going on at incredible speeds. And those themselves are then have this subatomic level. So even our bodies are constantly changing. And of course we can understand that, because gradually over time things wear down and break apart. But we're so surprised when that happens, because we don't expect it. And the reason why we get so upset is because we haven't realized impermanence. There's the word again, realize. We haven't realized actually all the time these things are falling apart. Everything around us is decaying all the time. Some things faster than others. So when things actually collapse and break, we shouldn't be surprised. It's the nature of every single thing around us, impermanence. There are some permanent phenomena in Buddhism, but the things that we see with our senses, for example, they're all impermanent. Well, I'm not sure that's true. Someone probably debate me on that one later, but you know what I mean. So that's just a good way into this topic, because as I say, those are things that appear to exist one way, and we live our lives based on what we see and what we instinctively believe. Although we know intellectually that these things are changing, we know no one's going to dispute the fact, well, hopefully in this group, no one's going to dispute the fact of science that these things are made up of cells or subatomic levels, etc. That's how things exist now. We've understood that. We're quite a fortunate position from where we are, as a species, to understand that. But we don't act that way. We act instinctively like things that are going to last forever. And people and our bodies is also one thing. So that's why that impermanence is related to understanding that people can be gone just like that as well, because their bodies have been constantly, since the moment they were born, have been decaying and falling into the next life, you could say. It's not a stable system. Inherently, it is unstable. there's nothing, it's not to get depressed about. It's just that's just the facts, at some point, all our body's going to break down, and the mind won't be able to survive it any longer, so it'll have to pass on to another life because the body won't sustain it anymore. And that's happening every minute, every second, every millisecond, every moment. So does that give you a taste of, how we're supposed to be thinking about things around us? Now let's think about an example of emptiness then, so we get an idea of where we're going with this. In these texts, they always talk about tables and cups, because I think that's just what they had next to them in these monasteries, and it's always the tables and cups. But we could talk about all kinds of things. I mean, cars is a good one. Should we talk about cars? So let's introduce this topic. We're going to talk a bit more in the next few weeks, but I think it was one Buddhist master called Chandrakirti had this a line of reasoning to prove emptiness that was using a chariot, but we don't have those anymore, so we'll just look at a car instead. So let's look at a car. So looking at a car, it has many parts, right? But when we look at a car, it's just like one thing, it gets you from A to B. It's got 4 wheels, etc. You put some petrol in it. It's expensive, but we can still do it. And then we get to work and a few families, etc., and drive back. This car has a function. It's like a solid thing. We think instinctively there is a car in there, but let's investigate. Okay, let's just do a little thought experiment and pull apart the car and see if we can find the car in the car. Right, that's what we're going to do. We're going to try and find the car within the car. We're searching here for the inherently existing car. So if it exists inherently, if it exists inherently in the car, we should find it. This is logical, right? If it's there, we have to be able to find the car. So we think, well, people just say, well, of course the car's there. I can see it with my eyes. I'm not stupid, but let's look. Where is it exactly? So they point to, well, there's the car. So you point to the door. So the door is the car. So then we look at the door thinking, well, is the door the car? Now, it seems like we're just talking about semantics here, but it has a profound point. Just go with it. So you can't say the door is the car, can you? Because that'd be bizarre. You can't say the wheel is the car. You can't say the window screen is the car. You see what I'm saying? You can't say that the exhaust is the car. I could go on with parts of the car. I'm not a mechanic, so I'm going to get stuck at some point. We could say that the steering wheel is the car, but that would be bizarre. So you can't just point to you can't point to anything in this car that is the car. So you say, well, it's everything is the car. But when we investigated with the mind, with our analysis, with our wisdom, with our sharp wit, actually we couldn't point to anything that was actually the car. So what do you think about that? What does your mind say to you when you hear these things? What is it? Because in your mind, you have these little dialogues thinking, no, that's not right. But what about this, blah, blah, blah. And this is kind of what you have to listen to. This is the way we're going to start debating with our wisdom and debating our ignorance.
I just had, shut up, Kerry. The car is the sum of all of those parts you mentioned.
With all the parts. Okay, good. Yeah. With all those parts. But where is it then? You're just going to point to, as soon as you point to anything, it's not there. As soon as you point to something, it isn't that.
I'm not going to point. I'm going to go, ta-da!
So now what is interesting is that it's only a car when it's in a certain order as well, because if we took all those parts of the car, just laid them on the floor, like ready to assemble, the body and the engine and all these other parts and the paint, etc., and the people that we put together, we just threw it in the corner. Would you say that was a car?
No, car parts.
But nothing's changed. It's exactly all the same pieces, just in a different order. But now you say it's not a car. That's completely illogical. Which is it?
You're right there. I take your challenge, boss. I'll say still the sum of all the parts assembled.
Assembled. Okay. Right. What about then if it, if it's not, if you can't drive it, for example, if it's broken down, or if it's got no petrol, or if it's If it's not performing as a car, if you can't drive it to A and B for whatever reason, if the tires are flat, or I don't know, if it's got the engine bits missing, I'm not a mechanic again, and it's not doing that, is it still a car? Because a car is something that drives you to A and B, right?
Yeah.
If it's not doing that, is it still a car?
Yeah, I still stick with my previous one. All the parts assembled, it's a car. It's just not fulfilling its function if it is not doing what it was designed to do.
Right, exactly. Good. Yeah. So there's still, the car exists. We're not saying the car doesn't exist. It has to exist. It exists. We decided that we've somehow at some point in the past decided that this thing that has 4 wheels and you get inside and drive around it, we've called that a car. At some point we labeled it a car. We decided, well, I didn't decide, I don't know who decided that, but anyway, somehow it got labeled a car. And because of the certain assembly of parts and its function. If this thing with 4 wheels and a steering wheel and windows and an engine never went anywhere ever, it'd be difficult then to say it was a car, because it might just be I don't know, a piece of art. It might just be a film set car, or it might be something else. You wouldn't really call it a car. You'd say it's like a car, but it's not actually a car because you can't go anywhere in it. Same with this table. It has 4 legs and top. You know, all those parts, you know, perform the function of a table, so I can put things on it. But as soon as it's 4 legs and no top, then, you know, is it a table? Because I can't put anything on it anymore. So it's just 4 legs. So it doesn't really function. As soon as I put a top on it, okay, now it's a table because I can put things on it. So I'm calling it a table now. But if I take the tabletop off, it's just 4 legs, then I wouldn't call it table anymore. I just call it 4 legs. If I put 4 legs in the tabletop on the floor in a random pattern, that's also not a table. But if I put 2 legs on one side and then just left 2 on the floor, that wouldn't be a table either. It's got to be, well, you know, it's got to stand up anyway. You can have 3 legs, can't you, I suppose? So it has to be in a certain order for us to decide it's called a table. So that's what it means when we say, you know, things are merely labeled by the mind, because when you look for this table in these parts of the table, you can't find it. It's only when it gets to a certain order and a certain function that actually now we call it a table. Before then, it wasn't a table. So at some point, it magically becomes a table. And as soon as I take the top off, it's no longer a table. So what that's indicating to us is actually this object is just performing a function in a certain order, and I've labeled it something. But what our mind does instinctively is it assumes that as soon as this tabletop has gone, the 4 legs are there and it's performing a function, we assume that, there's the table. I can point to it now. So without analysis, yes, you know, we call it a table. It's right. We didn't call things, you know, we get confused. It's very helpful to conceptually call this table a table. It helps, you know, you say pass the table or put things on the table. It's very helpful, right? But under analysis, it's much more fragile than that, because inherently there is no table here. It's only an assembly of bits and pieces in performing a certain function.
I'm going to really be antisocial in groups now, because I'll be like analysing all of this, and I might even mention the car. People just leave me alone.
Now, where it gets really exciting is we have to think about ourselves, because the really juicy meditations about emptiness is when we get to our self, our person, our body. I'm going to talk a little about that next week, because I don't want to go too far this week. I just want to introduce some of these concepts, but we'll look at that next week.
Cool.
So I once had this little animation. I don't know if I'll be able to find it. It was like a snowman. It was a little snowman. It had these parts like the body, the nose, which is the carrot, obviously, and the hat, and then the little coal for the buttons on the front. And they're all kind of like milling about separately on the screen. I was thinking, oh, this is not a snowman. What is this? And then suddenly at one point, all these parts kind of got together and in the right order. And suddenly I thought, oh, there's a snowman. And then suddenly the next second it was gone because the parts had moved again. So it was only that 1 second where there was actually a snowman. But all the parts are there just because they got into that certain order. Suddenly my mind went, bam, oh, concrete thing there. That is a snowman. And then suddenly the parts moved again. It was gone. So it's a very interesting way to see how the mind is being tricked, or how we're projecting these things.
But Carrie, this is just so. We don't have, well, at least I don't have even. Well, it just happens, isn't it? There's no space. There's no space to think that it's only a collection of parts and it performs a function. We all say, "Oh, this is a car." We don't think it's a parts.
Parts.
Yeah.
Performing
Parts of the car. And it's actually not a car.
It is a car.
On one level, yes, it is a car.
Yeah, so I can't say for definite because I haven't realized emptiness. I'm just, like you. I see things as I believe that things exist how they appear. But apparently, what happens when you realize emptiness as you go along, then when you see it directly, there's different levels of it. You kind of go through it conceptually, and then you get a bit clearer, and then at some point, apparently, the mind sees things exactly as exist directly without ignorance in the way. And then, even though things appear to exist after that, you never believe it again because you've seen it directly how it actually exists. So I'm going to talk about that as we go along. So I imagine that's what's happening, for someone who's realized emptiness. They understand that the car's there, but they'll never ever believe again that it exists inherently because they've already seen directly how it exists. So it's like, once I've turned the light on this room and seen that there's no elephant in it, even if it's dark again, I'll know there's no elephant. If someone tells me there's elephants in the room, I'll go, well, I know you're completely lying because I've seen it. I've seen there's no elephant. But they'll go, no, it could be. It could have walked in. I said, well, no, I've seen the doors are locked and everything. Well, it's an analogy, it's not going to go too well. But anyway, you know what I mean.
Yeah, but you've now got me thinking about the phrase "the elephant in the room," and you've made the elephant in the room.
Elephant in the room.
So you've gone hyper deep psychology. all these different ways.
It's really getting messy now, isn't it?
Yeah. New level.
Right. So what we need then is to accumulate lots of positive karma so that we can study this topic of emptiness. And we're going to have to get really clear what ignorance is doing. That's the first step. We have to understand exactly how we're misinterpreting things. And then we debate with it. So with the debate with the ignorance, we'll say, well, if you think it's like this, if you think this car exists inherently, then where is it? And let's investigate it in any kind of debate. And you prove to the ignorance that actually it can't exist that way. So you might say, well, let's look at this car. Then we know the car isn't inherently existent because you talk about the parts. So what about the steering wheel of the car? Let's look at that. So, okay, well, maybe the steering wheel exists inherently. We know the car generally now doesn't exist inherently. We've accepted that. We know it's merely put on its parts. But let's look at one of the parts. So maybe this part of the steering wheel, maybe that's where the inherent existence is. So keep going. But then the
just let me in. It's just my iPhone. My MacBook's no go in a minute. So no, sorry to confuse.
I got confused. There's two people.
Yeah.
Sorry,
just in case my laptop goes. Thank you.
Sure.
Recording in progress.
Yeah.
Sorry, I've lost my track. That's all now.
Sorry.
Where was I?
How we are misinterpreting things. We need to understand that and be clear about that.
Right. So if we go into this part, the steering wheel, we also realize the steering wheel has parts. So then we're back to the square one because, the steering wheel has this like leather outside. It has this kind of structure in the middle of the steel bit. It has little nuts and bolts in there. So you take apart all the parts of the steering wheel and you're left with this bunch of parts that is no longer the steering wheel. So you can't find the inherent existence in the steering wheel either. So then you go to the screw, or the screws, let's take that. So you think maybe the inherent existence is there. So you look in the parts of the screw. It's got this top, it's got this kind of curved bit around with the grooves in it. It's got this metal bit, it maybe got some kind of little plastic coating on the top there. So you're taking all those parts of it and realize actually you separate all those out into little bits and pieces and then realize there's no screw there either. So the further down you go into it, you just keep repeating the same pattern. There's no inherent existence in anything, anywhere, even down to the smallest atom. Even the atoms also have parts. Even the subatomic particles, they have parts. There's nowhere it doesn't end. Everything has parts. So therefore nothing can exist independently. We'll look at that anyway. There's another reason to prove emptiness, dependent arising. And the juicy one is to do with our bodies. So let's think of our bodies. Our body is, you know, my body's here. It's got all these parts. But if I try and find me, I in there, that's a really juicy investigation. You could take it down to the cells, but the cells have parts. Even those have, you know, parts, etc. And then we're just back to the atomic level again. And then we're back to, you know, subatomic level, and then bam, bam, bam. We're back to nothing again. But they do exist. I do exist. I am talking about emptiness, so I do exist. And Lama Zopa does this fantastic meditation about time. So we're actually kind of meditating now, really. We're just thinking about it. So that's all we're doing, meditating. So we think about a year. So where is a year? A year is 365 days. So where is the year? Is it one of those days? So we take a day. Well, a day is made up of 24 hours. So maybe one of these hours is where the year is, or the day is. So we look into the hours, but when we use hours also has parts, has 60 minutes. So maybe the year is in there somewhere. Maybe it's in the minutes. So look into the minutes, and each of those minutes is made to seconds. So maybe the year is in the seconds. So look at the seconds, and you get down to milliseconds and nanoseconds. Eventually the time becomes, you know, too small for us to measure. But at no point in any of this investigation have we found a year. It's all just been made of parts. There's nowhere where we've actually found a year. It's just a concept that we've created based on what we're calling time, right? Passing of seconds. But even seconds, those we can't find those seconds either. So if we can't find the smallest part of something, then obviously the bigger parts also aren't going to exist inherently anywhere. So how do they exist? They do exist, but they exist as mere concepts. We've labeled them depending on their function and their, you know, order. And that's all it needs to be. We don't need to make it any more complicated than that. Why should they exist in and of themselves? They function perfectly all right as empty. They're doing all right without having to think of them as inherently existent. Actually, they can't function if they're inherently existent. Things are already empty out there. They're already functioning well because they're empty. They're functioning because they're empty. As soon as you start adding inherent existence, things become untenable and they can't function then, which we'll look at. Maybe. So yeah, that was a bit more further into the rabbit hole, which is emptiness, return existence, and the wisdom realizing that. So just to recap then, we need to think about ignorance as this misknowing. All the afflicted states of mind, delusional states of mind have this element of misknowing, them knowing things wrongly. And we talked about how, you know, attachment knows things wrongly in a certain way, aversion-based minds, they know things wrongly in a certain way. And they're the branches of this root, ignorance, which is the cause of samsara. So those three root delusions, attachment, aversion, ignorance, is what keeps us tied in. And the ignorance is what we have to counteract, this antidote, this opposite to be able to get out of samsara. And we do that by wisdom realizing emptiness. So once we have the wisdom realizing emptiness, the ignorance, which sees things as inherent existent, can't exist in the mind at the same time. Realizing that things don't exist inherently and realizing things do exist inherently can't occupy the same space at the same time. So once we've got one, the other one is excluded. And there, at that point, we'll have the key, the tool to finally get out of samsara. And the more we meditate on that realization of emptiness, we'll clear all the garbage out of the mind. It takes a bit of process to then go through the different levels, the subtlety of that ignorance and removing it through meditations. And then once we've removed the last little bit, we'll become a foe destroyer. We have destroyed the foe, which is the ignorance. Thinks things exist inherently. They will have got rid of it all. We'll become an arhat, a foe destroyer, which is what we're aiming for. for the sake of all sentient beings. So let's just finish with a dedication then. As I said last week, even just thinking about emptiness for ourselves, it kind of puts a crack in the whole of our samsaric existence. So we've done that now, by this merit we've created together, thinking about emptiness. We've started to destroy the very foundations of our suffering existence. So any merit we've created, may this be causes for us to become fully enlightened, so that we can help all sentient beings become enlightened by realizing emptiness. So I'm just going to try and remember the Lama Zopa's prayer. So we'll dedicate that this I, which doesn't exist from its own side, may it achieve enlightenment, which doesn't exist from its own side. We need all sentient beings who are completely empty of existing from their own side to that state of enlightenment, which is completely empty of existing from its own side, by myself alone, who is completely empty of existing from my own side. All right. So next week, we're going to start looking at some of the reasons. We're going to get technical next week. We're going to start looking at the fourfold reason to prove emptiness. We're going to start looking at some of the some of the more of the kind of terminology around emptiness, and then what we have to do now is you have to figure out how we're going to meditate on emptiness, how we're going to debate it, the reasons that prove that this is real to the mind, and that's what we're going to start looking at next week. There's quite a few reasons, and the main one, the king of reasons, is called dependent arising. So we'll look at that. That takes some thought. Okay, so far so good.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kerry.
Okay, good luck. Just when you're wandering around, just think about impermanence. Maybe just think of that one. If your emptiness is a step too far, remembering impermanence is a good chunk of the way there already. So you start to just look at things around you and yourself and your body and the events, emotions, etc., and realize actually they're all changing every moment. Nothing is solid, concrete around us. So that might help us just loosen up a little bit and not get so graspy and false with things. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you, Kerry. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night. Good night, everyone. Bye-bye.